Thank you. Good morning. I would like to focus today on the legal limitations which apply to the Knesset itself as a legislative branch and perhaps even the constituent assembly of the State of Israel in light of Israel's nature as a Jewish state. Israel's affinity to the Jewish people is not its sole characteristics. In both the Declaration of Independence and the Israeli Basic Laws, Israel is defined as a Jewish and democratic state. This calls into question the relationship between the Jewish nature and the democratic nature of the state, and especially the limits which apply to the Knesset on the basis of democratic considerations in passing legislation intended to promote the Jewishness of the state. I suggest first that there is a constitutional core of Jewishness which Israeli law does not empower the governmental authorities of the state to set aside. And second, that this core must be understood as consistent with Israel's nature as a democracy. The Knesset, even in its role as the constituent assembly, is subject to the binding basic values which is set forth in the Declaration of Independence. This does not mean that any deviation from Jewish or democratic characteristics which appears in a basic law will be considered as an unauthorized action. Only a basic law which bears a significance tantamount to the abolition of the state will be rejected. Israel's two basic laws which concern human rights are Basic Law Human Dignity and Liberty and Basic Law Freedom of Expression. Section 2 of each of these basic laws on human rights reads as follows. The purpose of this basic law is to protect human dignity and liberty in order to establish in a basic law the values of the State of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. No statute can ever been rejected by the Israel Supreme Court, has ever been rejected by Israel Supreme Court on the grounds that the statute in question does not befit the values of the state. The significance of the section therefore appears to be that the protection of human rights shall be carried out in the spirit of the values of the State of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. An additional central provision of a basic law which reflects the supreme constitutional values of Israel as Jewish and democratic state is Section 7a of Basic Law of the Knesset, which state that candidates' lists shall not participate in elections to the Knesset, and a person shall not be a candidate for election to the Knesset if the goals or actions of the list or the actions of the persons expressly or by implication includes 1. Negation of the existence of the State of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, 2. Incitement to racism, and 3. Support for armed struggle by a hostile state or a terrorist organization against the State of Israel. This section considers the Jewishness and the democratic nature of Israel as jointly characterizing its very existence and eliminates the possibility that members of lists of candidates or individual candidates who oppose the existence of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state will be elected to Israel's legislative body. Indeed, there is a problem with the exploitation of membership in the legislative body of the state in order to undermine its very existence. At the same time, as was written by the Israeli Supreme Court, the disqualification of lists and candidates merely because they are not ideologically bound by the basic values of the state, is likely to remove significant minority groups from the political game. Most of the members of the Arab minority do not seek to promote the values of the state as a Jewish state. On the other hand, among the Jewish population, there are groups which are not bound up by the values of the state as a democratic state, which treats its Arab citizens with full equality. And accordingly, the Israeli Supreme Court have ruled that an ideology which remains at the level of a mere theory or ideal, and which is not accompanied by political activity intended to give rise to the attainment thereof, does not constitute cause for disqualification. A list of candidates shall only be disqualified if its political activity is principally devoted to striving to harm the protected values. What are the values which, from a constitutional point of view, reflect the Jewishness of Israel? These, in the words of the Supreme Court, are values which are centered on the right of every Jew to immigrate to the state of Israel, in which the Jews will constitute a majority. Hebrew is the central official language of the state, and most of its holidays reflect the national renaissance of the Jewish people. The heritage of the Jewish people is a central component of the religious and cultural heritage of the state and of site. It may perhaps be possible to dispute some of the details in this definition, but at the same time, although there is nothing which prevents Israel from also recognizing the collective rights of the non-Jewish minorities which live in it, and to a certain degree it recognizes those rights even today, it appears that the state cannot be constitutionally defined as a multicultural state. There is not necessarily a contradiction between a Jewish state and a state for all its citizens. This depends on the meaning of a state for all its citizens. And indeed, as was written by the Israeli Supreme Court, if the purpose of Israel's being a state for all its citizens is directed exclusively towards ensuring domestic equality among citizens and recognizing the rights of the minority which lives within our midst, this does not negate the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish state. But on the other hand, if the purpose seeks to detract from the rationale which underlies the establishment of the state, and thereby to negate the nature of the state as the state of the Jewish people, this is capable of prejudicing the minimal core characteristic which characterize the state of Israel as a Jewish state, end of quote. And accordingly, within the framework of the state of Israel, it is not possible to cancel the right of return, although it is possible to modify various details of the existing law of return, or the central status of Jewish and Hebrew culture, just as it is not possible to eliminate the fundamental elements of democracy: free elections, separation of powers, and human rights. The core approach is also based on the need for a broad, though probably not an absolute, consensus among the citizens of the state with respect to the nature of its values. The public has different ways of understanding the Jewishness of the state, and it is fitting and proper for the constitutional understanding thereof to reflect a broad common denominator. This also applies in light of the significance of a constitution as limiting the legislative power of the majority. This is because it is appropriate, whether possible, to interpret constitutional rules in a way which does not limit the power of the elected authorities, which represent the public, where such a limitation is unnecessary. A co-interpretation of the constitutional values of Israel as a Jewish state is also required for a coherent understanding of its nature as a Jewish and democratic state without giving rise to contradiction between the Jewish values and the democratic values and Jewish and democratic values. The interpretation of a legal rule necessitates the attribution of a coherent meaning to the rule. And this means that there is a duty of interpreting the basic laws in a way which attributes a meaning to them, and not in a way which renders it meaningless. And indeed, as the Israeli Supreme Court pointed out, an interpretive concept which is common to all of the provisions in the concept which considers the expression the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is a single cause which consists of two components, Jewish and democratic. And such a meaning is implicit in the wording of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, which defined Israel as a Jewish state and determined that the state of Israel will be open to Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. And the same declaration went on to state that, and I'm quoting, the state of Israel will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will be safeguard the holy places of all religions and will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. And in the long run, this is, I believe, the constitutional significance of the Jewishness of Israel. Thank you.